My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn. My Lords, it is my privilege to pay tribute to a remarkable parliamentarian, Sir Edward Heath. Born Edward Richard George Heath in 1917, Sir Edward grew up in Broadstairs, the son of a carpenter. He attended a state grammar school, Chatham House School in Ramsgate, and then went up to Balliol College, Oxford, where he won the college's organ scholarship in his first term. He showed his political independence early on in life. In 1938, he actively opposed the policy of appeasement toward Nazi Germany pursued by Neville Chamberlain. In the Oxford by-election, just after Chamberlain's deal with Hitler in Munich at the end of September, Sir Edward campaigned for A.D. Lindsay, the Master of Balliol, who stood as an anti-appeasement candidate against the official Conservative candidate and later Lord Chancellor, Quintin Hogg. Later that autumn, he was elected President of the Oxford Union. Ted Heath, as he was to everyone, was of that generation of Prime Ministers who experienced active service. During World War II, he served in the Royal Artillery. His pre-war and wartime experiences were important in shaping his views about Europe and the need to prevent future conflict. After serving in the army, Ted Heath worked in the Ministry of Civil Aviation. He went on to become editor of the Church Times before going into merchant banking. In 1950, he entered Parliament, narrowly winning the seat of Bexley. He went on to hold the seat until his retirement in 2001. His maiden speech in the House of Commons concerned European unity, a theme to which he would return throughout his long career. In February 1951, he became an assistant whip. After a succession of posts in the whip's office, he was made parliamentary secretary to the Treasury and chief whip under Anthony Eden in December 1955. He served in the role of chief whip between 1955 and 1959 and is widely credited with holding the Conservative Party together during the Suez Crisis. He went on to be appointed Minister for Labour, later Lord Privy Seal, and then President of the Board of Trade. His competence and success in these roles helped his prospects for the leadership, which he won in 1965, aged 49. He was the first Conservative leader to be elected by his fellow MPs, defeating Reginald Maudling and Enoch Powell for the post. In 1970, he unexpectedly led his party to victory and held office as Prime Minister for just under 4 years. My Lords, Ted Heath was a man of enormous integrity. I will remember him particularly for 3 things. First, his firm stance against capital punishment. Second, his commitment to one-nation politics, which was shown when he decided that Enoch Powell, after a speech in the West Midlands, could no longer continue on the Conservative front bench. It was a brave decision, one which I remember my parents applauding at the time. And third, his commitment to Europe, through winning French acceptance of British entry into the European Economic Community. He later played a leading role in the campaign to secure a yes vote in the referendum on our membership. In office, Ted Heath had to face the crisis of violent conflict in Northern Ireland, over which he imposed direct rule from Westminster in 1972. He was unable, however, to deal with Britain's mounting economic problems. Hoping to win a new mandate, he called a general election during the miners' strike in February 1974, and the Conservatives lost seats to Labour. Failing to form a coalition government, he was succeeded as Prime Minister by Lord Wilson in March. Defeated again in another general election in October, he was replaced as party leader by Margaret Thatcher in 1975. My Lords, Ted Heath remained active in Parliament, making interventions, particularly in support of the pro-European cause and representing his constituents. He went on to become Father of the House before retiring from Parliament over half a century after first entering. It is this House's loss that he did not become a member here. Outside politics, Sir Edward pursued his interests, sailing and music, with the same passion and dedication that he demonstrated in his parliamentary life. He was a keen sailor, and despite having taken up yachting relatively late in life, he won the Sydney-Hobart race in his yacht Morning Cloud in 1969. Later, as Prime Minister, he skippered Britain's Admiral's Cup winning boat in 1971. He's well known for taking his grand piano with him to 10 Downing Street, and I'm told that he continued to conduct the annual Christmas concert of his hometown choir in Broadstairs, even when Prime Minister. In 1992, he was made a member of the Order of the Garter. My lords, he will be remembered with great respect. He was a man of integrity who served both this country and Parliament with dignity and distinction. I beg to move.
Yeah. My lords, the question is the House to now adjourn.
My lords, I rise to support the noble Baroness, a leader of the House, in the motion that she has put before us. Today we mourn the death of Sir Edward Heath, and it is a privilege indeed to follow the noble Baroness, the leader of the House, in her just tribute. We've lost another link with the 20th century, especially that link with the war years. He was the last Conservative leader to see active service in war and served with distinction, being mentioned in dispatches in the closing stages of the Second World War, for which he was awarded the MBE military division. And as a result of his wartime experience, he vowed to do all he could to avoid it ever happening again. Elected to another place in 1950, he was appointed a whip by Churchill the following year and was rapidly promoted to Deputy Chief Whip and subsequently Chief Whip. His powers of persuasion, my lords, must have been unrivaled. In this role, he rendered invaluable service to the country during the Suez Crisis in keeping the government and his party together. In 1960, Macmillan appointed Ted Heath as Lord Privy Seal, responsible for negotiating Britain's entry into the EEC. He led a superb negotiating team whose successful efforts foundered because of de Gaulle's surprise repudiation of Britain's application in 1963. Later on, my lords, he was Secretary of State for Trade, Industry and Development and an early deregulator, not without controversy in the case of resale price maintenance. But it was upon Sir Alec Douglas Hume's resignation in 1965 that he achieved the leadership of the Conservative Party in the first election for the post, rather surprisingly defeating Reggie Maudling. He presided in opposition over a period of strenuous policy rethinking and so-called preparation for government. In 1970, he became Prime Minister, an outcome that the polls at the start of the campaign had indicated was practically impossible. He inherited a challenging economic situation and struggled to find a way forward. His term of office was characterized by difficult challenges, and two were especially crippling. The first was the tragic early death of Ian MacLeod, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, and one of the most brilliant members of his cabinet. The second was the oil crisis of 1973, which sent huge inflationary shockwaves throughout the world economy. But it was his attempt to control the spiraling might of the trade unions which ultimately destroyed his government and set the tone for industrial relations and legislation over the next 15 years. It was a terrible time for the nation. However, on a small and personal note, I remember as a schoolboy in the early 1970s, I remembered well that feeling of anticipation that the lights might go out so that there was a perfect excuse not to have studied the conjugation of irregular Latin verbs. My lords, in 1974 he lost the crisis election in terms of seats, in spite of a lead in the popular vote. In good times and bad, he conducted himself with integrity, never more perhaps than when he was forced to suspend Stormont and transfer the government of Northern Ireland to Westminster. The Sunningdale Agreement of 1973, short-lived though it was a bold and imaginative precursor of the Belfast Agreement more than 25 years later. Sir Edward served as an MP for over half a century. He was a wise and well-regarded father of the House until his retirement in 2001. He took the decision not to join our benches here, something I regret, and we are surely all the poorer for that. However, his heart belonged utterly to another place. His life was dominated by service, and in particular service to his constituents, fellow MPs, and the nation. He was, my lords, a man of the Commons. There's no doubt that we've lost a political giant, and the world of politics is today a duller place. Edward Heath will largely be remembered as the man who led Britain into the European Economic Community, an achievement of which he was deservedly proud, and which at the time was very widely supported by those who were tired of Britain's failures and saw our European neighbours pulling far ahead. He was a man of great principle, and these principles guided him in everything he did. He was an old-school politician. Not for him the modern spin machine or the insincere charm offensive. He was brusque and honest. He did not curry favour with colleagues, often to his detriment, or of his opponents. One always knew where one stood. After losing office, he continued his international work and famously led a mission to Baghdad in 1990, which successfully secured the release of 33 hostages. But also there is one further aspect of Ted Heath's life that is worth mentioning. One never felt that he really overcame his ousting as Prime Minister, and certainly was never entirely reconciled to those he felt were responsible. He rarely saw good in what followed him and refused to come to terms with the changing nature of the Conservative Party and indeed of Europe and the world at large. That must have been a sad weight to bear. However, he also combined high office with great achievements in the world beyond politics. He had a real hinterland. His lifelong passion for music and skills at making it led to his conducting orchestras all over the world, and he was a yachtsman of real distinction, winning the Sydney-Hobart race in 1969 and captaining Britain's victorious Admiral's Cup team in 1971. It seems incredible, my lords, now, that only 35 years ago, a leader of the opposition and subsequently a Prime Minister could take so much time to take part in such events. There is perhaps, my lords, a lesson for us all in that. My lords, Ted Heath was a man who understood the word duty and all that it meant. He led by example in putting the interests of the nation first and foremost, a statesman in every sense of the word. People will argue for years about his political legacy, particularly that on Europe. But what is certain is that the nature of his commitment and contribution to our island's story will remain unchallenged.
My lords, Lord Strathclyde is quite right. We seem to be living through a period almost like the end of an epic play where the characters that we've grown accustomed to quietly take their leave of us. That generation of civilians who turned themselves into soldiers to defeat Nazism in Europe and whose victory over 60 years ago we all celebrated very recently. And they returned, of course, with that mood of never again and a determination to win the peace that took them into public life, into all parties. Recently, I was supposed to address the European Movement's Veterans Group at a lecture which had been given last year by Sir Edward Heath. And as part of my research for that, I looked up his lecture, and he talked very much of that life-changing visit he made in 1939 with his friend Madron Seligman to Nazi Germany and other parts of Europe. And it certainly was, along with the war, the experience which shaped, I think, the rest of his political life. The only thing I would also say from my researches is that Mr. Seligman was extremely irritated during that trip by Ted Heath's insistence on playing Colonel Bogey on a penny whistle at every opportunity. Considering that they were travelling through Germany at the time, it was a strain of recklessness about Ted Heath which we don't usually associate with him. I can also vouch for the surprise of the 1970 victory, standing in Transport House as I was as those first results came in. But the interesting thing, and it's been mentioned about his commitment to Europe, was that it was never simply an economic decision. This is not the time to rerun that debate, but recently there was a documentary on the BBC about the 1975 referendum campaign that showed Ted Heath in all his pomp and vigour speaking at a rally in Trafalgar Square. And there his twin themes were peace and prosperity, the political aims of Europe that were consistent throughout his long life. What is also true is, coupled with that consistency, was considerable courage when he had to face other decisions. The decision to hold the Conservative Party on a strong line on Rhodesia at the time of UDI, when many Conservatives, including the very influential Lord Salisbury, were trying to take it in another direction. As already has been referred to, the sacking of Enoch Powell. And the third piece of courage, which my colleague Lord Dalacchia reminded me of, the decision to admit the Ugandan Asians. None of these soft options for a party leader. My own contacts with Ted Heath were spasmodic. I do remember attending a very small select dinner party in the city in the late 80s, where he was quite the star of the dinner party, and he divided his contributions into two halves. Absolute condemnation of Thatcherism and all its works, and a prediction that China was the coming country to which we should give attention. And I can assure you that he spoke about both with equal passion. He also, rather bizarrely, once invited me to speak at the Bexley Conservative Supper Club. I've never quite worked out whether what he wanted was to expose Bexley Conservatives to fresh ideas or to demonstrate to them the grim alternative. But I suspect that, like another Prime Minister who he often reminds me of, Sir Robert Peel, history will be kinder and warmer to him than some of his contemporaries. And perhaps his country and his party might have used him better over the last 30 years. Nevertheless, what an achievement. A scholar, a soldier, a statesman, father of the House and one of the great House of Commons men of this and any generation. And as Lord Strathclyde said, with that massive hinterland, a musician of talent, an international yachtsman, and a prolific and successful author. He almost pioneered the idea of book signing by politicians. I remember Harold Wilson rather enviously and sourly saying to me that it was the unsigned copies of Ted's books which had the rarity value. But in what he stood for and what he fought for, he was a man for all seasons. And we on these benches pay tribute to a great European and a great Englishman who fully understood that the two are perfectly and indeed essentially compatible.
Yeah. My Lords, it's a privilege on behalf of the Lord Spiritual to join in this tribute. Politicians face a very demanding vocation and vocation it certainly is, my lords. Something which those of us who from the sidelines of it reserve our right to make constant critical comments about politicians should, at least at the time like this, remember. And among the most demanding aspects of that vocation is its capacity to squeeze out the joyful and abundant things of life. And it is good that we should recall a politician who managed to avoid that. I wonder what public cares and anxieties were blown away by the wind or gathered up in the profound experience of music. Both activities which require total concentration, and in the leaders, the skipper, the conductor, require the capacity to bring others to the same degree of concentration, something which must have delighted Sir Edward enormously. And so we should be glad that we can remember a politician who did not allow his politics to squeeze life out of his life. And we should pray and hope that politics may, perhaps one might say once again, be an arena enriched by the possibility of politicians holding to life within their demanding calling. It will not just be good for them, it will be good for our politics, my lords. And as to the conflicts which are credited with bringing about his loss of power, well, perhaps we might judge in time that those conflicts were ones which were coming over our horizon in any case, and which were going to have to be faced, whichever politician happened to be in power at the time. And if we come to that conclusion, maybe history will judge Sir Edward less harshly than it might do at the moment. But above all, as I have said, it is for his spiritual contribution to politics, for his refusal to allow it to squeeze life out of politics, that I would wish today particularly to be grateful, and for which I hope he will continue to be remembered. May he rest in peace, and with all the just rise in glory.
My lords, on behalf of the crossbench peers, I add my voice to the tributes paid today to Sir Edward Heath. He will be principally remembered for his 4 years as Prime Minister, stirring years for the country and for brave decisions, and for his long period as a parliamentarian. But we like also to remember that he held office also as Minister of Labour, Lord Privy Seal with Foreign Office responsibilities, and as Secretary of State for Industry, Trade and Regional Development. I think that it may sometimes be forgotten that he was a politician who believed in a fairer distribution of wealth and opportunities among the population, and I appreciate that. He did, after all, write a book entitled The Tory Approach to Social Problems, but as a crossbench peer I cannot comment on the content. Now, as I spent my career in the public services of the United Kingdom and the European Union, I'm of course particularly aware of his conviction that the future of Britain was profoundly bound up with the development of Europe, and of his enthusiasm which drove forward the negotiations for UK membership of the European Community. I remember that very well, and I do particularly remember his French accent. His belief in the European Community and in Britain's role within it remained with him throughout his life, and I do remember it most recently when I met him, which was not long ago. He had not changed at all. Now, in this House, we know there are divided views on the European Union, but United Kingdom membership is indeed Edward Heath's legacy. And his career and interests outside politics have been already mentioned: an impressive and winning yachtsman and an outstanding conductor, with, of course, a number of his orchestral works recorded. They are still available in the shops. He was chairman of the London Symphony Orchestra Trust. He was vice president of the Bach Choir. He was president of the European Community Youth Orchestra and had many other musical interests. And the title of his book, Music, A Joy for Life, certainly reflected the spirit of his musical life. And he was always very happy with music, and in Salisbury, where he reprimanded my wife on one occasion very loudly for referring to his house in the cathedral yard, whereas in fact it is in fact in the cathedral close. Now, there are always differences of views in politics. It is at the heart of a vibrant nation, but Edward Heath's life reminds us how privileged we are to have men and women of his high integrity and quality as our leaders.
The question is that the House do now adjourn. As members of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.